We're all familiar with the major battles of the U.S. Civil War, most of which happened around Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Today, we're going to focus on the top 5 lesser known battles of the Western Theater on Tabletop History. So, our review of the Western battles, which we're defining as anything west of the Mississippi, starts with the Battle of Wilson's Creek. This is also known as the Battle of Oak Hills. In 1861, Confederates under Benjamin McCulloch and Missouri State Guard troops under Sterling Price approached Nathaniel Lyon's Army of the West, who were camped at Springfield. On August 10th, Lyon, in 2 columns commanded by himself and Sigel, attacked Confederates at Wilson's Creek, some 10 miles southwest of Springfield. Confederate cavalry received the first blow and retreated from the high ground. Confederate infantry then attacked Union forces 3 times during the day but failed to break through. Eventually, Sigel's column was driven back to Springfield, allowing the Confederates to consolidate their forces against Lyon's main column. When Lyon was killed and General Thomas William Sweeney was wounded, Major Samuel Sturgis assumed command of the Union forces. When Sturgis realized that his men were exhausted and lacking ammunition, he ordered a retreat to Springfield. The battle was called a Confederate victory, but the Confederates were too disorganized and ill-equipped to pursue the retreating Union forces. Although the state remained in the Union for the remainder of the war, the battle effectively gave Confederates control over southwest Missouri. The victory at Wilson's Creek also allowed Price to lead the Missouri State Guard north into a campaign. This was only resolved later at the Battle of Pea Ridge. The second battle of the Western Theater that you might not know about is the Battle of Glorieta Pass, March 26 through 28, 1862. This battle took place in northern New Mexico Territory, and it was the decisive battle of the New Mexico campaign during the American Civil War. Often called the Gettysburg of the West by some authors, it was intended as the decisive blow with Confederate forces to break the Union possession of the West along the base of the Rocky Mountains. It was fought at Glorieta Pass in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in what is now New Mexico, and was an important event in the history of the New Mexico Territory and the American Civil War. In the end, the Battle of Glorieta Pass was consequential. First, despite the fact that the Confederates took the field, they were forced to retreat to Santa Fe due to the destruction of their supplies, and eventually abandoned New Mexico Territory. Second, the battle at Glorieta foiled Sibley's plan to obtain his key objective, the capture of the major federal base at Fort Union. That would have broken federal resistance in New Mexico and compelled Union forces to retire north of Raton Pass back into the Colorado Territory. In any case, the dream of a Confederate stronghold in the Southwest was impracticable. New Mexico could not provide enough sustenance for any prolonged Confederate occupation. Furthermore, the approach of the federal California column eastward through the New Mexico Territory during the summer of 1862 would have seriously jeopardized Confederate control of the region. Number 3, the Battle of Forts Jackson and St. Philip. While technically taking place on the Mississippi River, we include this one because it was the decisive battle for possession of New Orleans in the American Civil War. The 2 Confederate forts on the Mississippi River south of New Orleans were attacked by a Union Navy fleet led by Admiral Farragut. As long as the forts could keep federal forces from moving on the city, it was safe. However, New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy, was already under the threat of attack from the north when Admiral Farragut moved in his fleet from the south. The battle is usually divided into 2 parts. First, a mostly ineffective bombardment of the Confederate-held forts by raft-mounted mortars, and the successful passage of the forts by much of Farragut's fleet on the night of April 24th. During the passage, 1 Federal warship was lost and 3 others turned back, while the Confederate gunboats were virtually obliterated. The subsequent capture of New Orleans, achieved with no further significant opposition, was a serious, even fatal blow from which the Confederacy never recovered. The forts remained after the fleet had passed, but the demoralized enlisted men in Fort Jackson mutinied and forced their surrender. The Battle of Honey Springs, sometimes known as the Affair at Elk Creek, was on July 17, 1863. This engagement was an important victory for Union forces in their efforts to gain control of the Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. It was the largest confrontation between Union and Confederate forces in the area that would eventually become Oklahoma. The engagement was also unique in the fact that white soldiers were the minority in both fighting forces. Native Americans made up a significant portion of each of the opposing armies, and the Union force contained 3 African American units. The battle, which took place near Chakota, Oklahoma, began on July 17th. A morning skirmish revealed that many of the Confederates had wet gunpowder, causing numerous misfires and accidents. The main Union attack began at mid-afternoon, and the beginning of a rain squall intensified. Opposing artillerymen each eliminated 1 gun on the opposing side during an early artillery duel. Then, an opportunity came when the 1st Colored Infantry attacked. Colonel James Williams led the Colored Volunteer Infantry forward, but the Confederates held their ground. Williams was wounded, but his troops conducted a disciplined withdrawal and sporadic firing continued. Victorious Union forces eventually took the Honey Springs Depot, burning what couldn't be immediately used and occupying the field. Blunt trumpeted the battle as a major victory, claiming Union losses of only 76 people, with enemy casualties in excess of 500. General Blunt did not pursue them because his own troops and forces were tired. He ordered them back to nearby Fort Gibson. The battle was the largest ever fought in Indian Territory and would prove to be decisive. The victory opened the way for Blunt's forces to capture Fort Smith in the Arkansas River all the way to the Mississippi River. The Confederates abandoned Fort Smith in August 1863, and despite notable efforts by different Confederate officers, the Confederate forces in the region would never again have the initiative or engage the Union in open battle, instead relying almost entirely on guerrilla warfare and small-scale cavalry actions to fight the Federal Army. Battle number 5 is the Lawrence Massacre. This is also known as Quantrell's Raid, and took place in Lawrence, Kansas on August 21, 1863. The Confederate forces, led by a guerrilla named William Quantrell, had a couple of very notable members of his party, Frank James and Jesse James, who later came to be known in the Old West. The Lawrence Massacre was one of the bloodiest events in the history of Kansas. Kansas was well known before the Civil War for being the focus of what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas, was the home of where abolitionist John Brown emerged, who was sometimes called the meteor of the war, for his efforts that proved to be a catalyst in helping to start the Civil War itself. Among these, Union and Confederate forces fought back and forth in Kansas throughout the entire war, where many historians see the Civil War as operating for some 5 years longer than it did elsewhere in the country. The attack on Lawrence was the product of careful planning. Quantrell had been able to gain the confidence of many leaders in independent Missouri groups known as bushwhackers, and chose the time and date of the attack well in advance. Different groups of riders from Missouri approached Lawrence from the east in several independent columns and converged with well-timed precision in the final miles before Lawrence in the pre-dawn hours of that chosen day. Many of the men had been riding for over 24 hours to make the rendezvous, and had lashed themselves to the saddle to keep riding if they fell asleep. Almost all were armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers. The raid was less of a battle and more of an execution. 2 weeks prior to the raid, a Lawrence newspaper had boasted that Lawrence was ready for any emergency over 500 fighting men, every one of whom would like to see Quantrell's raiders. However, the squad of soldiers temporarily stationed in Lawrence had returned to Fort Leavenworth, and due to the surprise, swiftness, and fury of the initial assault, the local militia was unable to assemble and mount a defense. In fact, most of those who were killed by Quantrell and his raiders were not carrying a weapon at all. The principal motive for the attack was revenge, and Quantrell's raiders entered Lawrence with lists of men to be killed and buildings to be burned. Senator James H. Lane was at the top of the list. Lane was a military leader and chief political proponent of the raids that have cut down through Missouri from Kansas in the early months of the Civil War. After the attack, Quantrell led his men south to Texas for the winter. By the next year, the raiders had disintegrated as a unified force and were so unable to achieve similar successes. Quantrell himself died of wounds he received in Kentucky in 1865, with only a few supporters left. Among those were Frank James and Jesse James. After Quantrell's attack, the Union posted several military outposts on Mount Oread, which is now home to the University of Kansas. No further attacks were ever made on Lawrence, and these installations were eventually abandoned and dismantled after the war. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content from us, where we go through and play out some of these historical battles, review different historical battles, and much more. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.